also mental health is like a really big passion of mine.
Interesting.
And I mean, it's a square part of my business as well.
Yeah, what do you got going on right now? Like, what's kind of give the background on those?
Yeah. So after shutting down my startup a few years ago, stepped full time into the coaching realm. So I'm leadership coach for entrepreneurs who have past trauma, whether they know it or maybe they're unaware of it. And so I'm trained in somatic experiencing, but I also have a core business background.
What's somatic experiencing?
Yeah, so somatic experience. So somatic is the language of your nervous system.
Okay.
And I think one of the most undervalued, let's say, skills and aspects of entrepreneurship is being able to manage the mental and the emotional side of things. Because a lot of people, including myself, I mean, it's a core part of my story, suffer from, burnout, or it just kind of brings up stuff from, let's say, unresolved stress from your past or unresolved trauma. So I operate like in this nice little Venn diagram of the business side of things and like leadership coaching and core business coaching, as well as the mental health side of things.
What is the like science behind unresolved trauma? Like, what is actually causing that to like have an effect later on in life?
Yeah. So what happens? The analogy that I like to use is, let's say you've got 100 candles burning, and each of those candles, belongs to you. It's your energy system. It's kind of the thing that kind of lights the way. It's your intuition. All these things. What happens with trauma is some of those get separated, and they start to loop, and they in this kind of in their own little kind of energetic loop where they don't know that the threat has passed. Like your nervous system doesn't know that the threat has passed. So instead of operating on all cylinders, let's say with all of that energy and kind of all of that light, from all those candles, now you're only operating with 70%, 60%, 50%. And it takes up a lot of energy. If you can actually look at brain scans of people who have, like the technical term is like a healthy normal brain. I don't love using that term because I think it's shameful for people who, like, let's say, have PTSD or past trauma. But a healthy normal brain, at rest, there's very little that kind of lights up. But if you look at a brain with somebody who has past trauma or PTSD, there are multiple centers of their brain that are actually lit up on that brain scan because they don't think that the threat has passed. Their nervous system is still stuck in survival mode. It's stuck in, let's say, a fight or flight, or very commonly a freeze mode. And that takes a tremendous amount of energy. And so kind of going back to that analogy, like all of that energy that could be used towards building your business, forming relationships, taking things to the next level, you don't have it. You don't have it. So you're not actually operating with 100% of what you could be moving forward with in your business.
Have you read The Untethered Soul?
Yeah.
Yeah, I read recently, like it talks about like how that energy kind of gets trapped within you. It sounds pretty similar to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
What's the like practice of breaking that trap or like getting out of that trap?
It's not one practice per se. It's, in my experience,
and there's probably a number of methodologies.
Yeah. Number of methodologies, things, core trauma modalities like EMDR, somatic experiencing, and others. But the key is to work with somebody who is trauma trained, not just somebody who's trauma informed, because there's a lot of BS out there where a lot of people, and this crosses the line between the therapy world, the coaching world, and others, because just because you are a licensed therapist doesn't mean that you are trauma informed, and it certainly doesn't mean that you're trauma trained, which I think a lot of people aren't aware of. And then, you take that to the coaching world, and it's kind of the wild.
There's a lot of bullshit out there.
There's a lot of bullshit out there.
Yeah.
A lot of bullshit out there. Because there's a lot of people who they have read The Body Keeps the Score, which is Bessel van der Kolk's book, one of the leaders in the trauma space. They read his book and they're like, oh, now I'm a somatic practitioner. Now I know how to deal with people's trauma. And that is far from the case. Trauma training takes years. And so if anybody's kind of looking for a practitioner, and again, this goes into the therapy world too, because I worked with a therapist in New York City when I was living there for 3.5 years. I was going twice a week and I made zero progress because he just wasn't trauma informed at all. Like he never once mentioned it.
What like methodology are you most closely aligned with? Is it like NLP type stuff or like
Somatic experiencing.
okay, so what
Yeah.
does that explain that to me? Like exactly like what is the practice, what is the methodology, how it works? Like
Yeah. So somatic experiencing is a modality that was developed by Dr. Peter Levine. Um, and it really stemmed from some of his early experiences as a clinician in the late 60s and early 70s. One of the stories that he tells is he had this woman who basically just had debilitating anxiety and had come in, and she essentially couldn't leave the house without her husband or just somebody to kind of help her and guide her, and would just go into like debilitating panic attacks, etc. And so he has her in his office and kind of gets her to a place where she's feeling a little more safe. And then all of a sudden it's like a switch flipped. And she essentially kind of goes into a bit of a panic attack. And just intuitively, he got this image of a tiger. And he said, there's a tiger chasing after you. Run. So she started to move her body. And for the better part of, let's say, an hour, she shook, she moved, and he wasn't 100% sure what was going on, but he was just really trusting the process here. And then all of a
this
sudden,
is completely intuitive.
at the time,
Yeah.
at the time, there is so much science and research behind this now.
Yeah.
And he will even say, he was like, yeah, I would have done that a lot differently had I known what I know now.
Gotcha.
But he had to kind of go through that experience to get where he is now.
Yep.
And eventually what surfaced was this memory of her being 4 years old and getting her tonsils out. And they had to hold her down to put the gas mask on her to put her to, get her under anesthesia. And that holding her down essentially in her nervous system was what we call an inescapable threat, because she was so terrified, so scared. Well, then of course the anesthesia takes effect and, kind of numbs her out. She wakes up, has no recollection of the experience whatsoever, but all of that energy and trauma got trapped in her nervous system. And those loops, that I was talking about earlier, I like to say like they come out sideways of like kind of inexplicably, because you're just like, wait, hold on. Because our nervous system works in flavorings. And so
What do you mean by that?
what I mean by don't worry, I'll explain everything. All good, brother. I'm glad you asked. Well, let's see what's behind door number 3.
Let's go. I'm ready.
Yeah, man.
Hopefully $1 million.
Yeah. Yeah, so.
Hopefully the cure to my trauma.
Yeah. So what happens, so back to the flavorings. Something doesn't need to kind of be an apples to apples comparison. Like, let's say if you have like childhood trauma or, maybe sexual trauma from, sexual assault when you're in your 20s or something like that, that reappears 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, because a situation doesn't have to be like an apples to apples comparison and a mirror image of what you went through. It just has to have a little bit of the flavor of what happened to you in the past. And so I'll just use an example from my own life. So I grew up with an alcoholic father. A lot of pressure put on me, parentified as a child, a lot of responsibility put on me that I just was not ready for and developmentally ready for, but just had to figure out. And in addition to that, I got really used to deferring to like authority figures, because, when you're a kid, your parents are your authority figures. So fast forward in my 20s and my 30s, I became very deferential to people and, to authority figures. So that's that flavoring.
Differential, you mean like you were, because they were putting so much pressure on you, they were taking that responsibility of decision making away from you. And so you relied on them as like an authoritative figure to make decisions for you?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean by that?
Sometimes yes, or it's just because my dad was very much like my way or the highway.
Right.
So
So he was
deferential.
taking that responsibility away from you to make your own decisions.
Yeah, in many cases,
Yeah.
for sure. And then, let's say whether it be like a boss, a manager, a VP, et cetera, I was always just like, yes, like I will do exactly what you say. And even if I had, let's say, an idea or a suggestion of, hey, I think we can do this better, because that was not welcome when I was a child. So then
You'd get an
in the
anxiety.
20s, yeah, a lot of anxiety. And so I would silence myself. I would, kind of squash my voice. And then, and I see this with a lot of, let's say, the business leaders or the entrepreneurs that I work with, of them silencing themselves, because, past trauma can really have, it has a profound effect on obviously our self-worth. And and then that translates to people just not speaking up more because they don't think that, their voice is worth it, or maybe speaking up wasn't welcome in the past. And so I do a lot of work with entrepreneurs to really help them kind of step into their authenticity, but really it comes back to safety. And so it's just, do they feel safe in their nervous system to be able to speak up, even if it's not going to be received well, because they know this is something that needs to be said in the meeting. Or, it's like, oh, I got a little bit of like an outlandish idea. We've all had moments where, we've got an idea and we really want to kind of say it. We're like, oh, like this sounds, it's a little bit outside of the norm. Right. And so we stay silent. And then 20 minutes later in the meeting, like, John is like, oh, he says the same idea. And you're like, oh, shoot. And everybody loves it. Right? Everybody loves it. But yeah, that's a little bit of, kind of like how trauma can show up in the workplace and entrepreneurship and whatnot.
So what is the work that you do with entrepreneurs to get through that trauma?
Yeah. So this gets back to, sorry, I went on like 4 tangents.
No, you're good. Doing the weave.
Yeah, totally. So this kind of gets back to like, what is somatic experiencing? It's a modality. So again, somatic is the language of your nervous system. And
what is that language? How is it communicating? Like what?
Yeah,
what's the actual like response of that?
Yeah, so it's essentially the language of sensation in your body. So I can sit there and without saying anything, and without even conversing, kind of tell what state your nervous system is in right now. And and right now you and I are kind of what we call like ventral vagal, like rest and digest. Like we're connecting, we feel social.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so that's the state that we want to be in most of the time. There's this common misconception that like, oh, like you're dysregulated, therefore something is wrong. It's like, no, like this person, broke your boundaries and like you're pissed off, and like that anger is dysregulation, but that's a healthy dysregulation. And so what happens with, entrepreneurs is like, it's what somatic experiencing does is it allows the cycles of nervous system responses and regulation to complete themselves. We talk a lot about the thing that wanted to happen but couldn't happen. So going back to the Peter Levine example, that little girl when she was 4 couldn't escape the operating table. And so this, all of that energy when he said like, hey, there's a tiger, run. It allowed her to move all of that energy of she wants to flee from this threat. And I see that all the time with entrepreneurs. And so, sorry, I'm bouncing around a little bit here. But going back to the language of your nervous system, it's the language of sensation. It's essentially the language of feeling. And it all happens on, I'm going to get a little nerdy like brain science here, if that's cool.
No, for sure.
It happens on what we call a subcortical level. Your brain develops in 3 stages. You got your brain stem, your limbic system, and then your prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the final part of your brain that actually fully develops. It's why we can't rent a car until we're 25 years old. And it's the executive decision-making and rational thinking part of your brain. That part can get shut down by subcortical. Your brainstem and your specifically your amygdala and your limbic system, they fire before your prefrontal cortex.
It's more like an impulsive response.
Exactly.
Have you read Think and Fast and Slow?
Yep.
Yeah, so it's like you're more fast thinking brain.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. Well, not even fast thinking brain, because it doesn't think. It's solely concerned with survival.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's the thing. So when somebody's having like an anxiety attack or something, they're like, I can't think straight. Well, there's a reason, because you literally can't think straight, because that part of your brain can shut down the functioning in your prefrontal cortex. And it really just is concerned with fight, flight, freeze. That's it. And so, but the thing is like these parts of our brains, they developed 500 million and 200 million years ago. So they're really, really old. You know, they're kind of pre, let's say, humans. But they developed to keep us safe, you know, kind of in the wild.
Right.
And they're not fully adapted to, let's say, modern day society, right? But what happens is those are the parts of our brain that end up staying in these loops. And you can't think your way out of these things because it's not a rational thinking process. So back to my process with, sorry, I got to lay the groundwork here. Back to my process with clients is, you know, so many of the people I work with, they are highly successful. They are like badass entrepreneurs who like are used to getting shit done. They were like the straight A students that got the degrees and then, you know, launched their businesses. And like they're used to being just kind of like they're used to knowing what to do and figuring things out and getting shit done. And then all of a sudden they feel stuck. And these are also people that have done a lot of both professional and personal development work. They have been to therapy. They go to the conferences. They listen to every personal development podcast known to man. And they still feel stuck. You know, they've read all the self-help books and they still feel stuck. And that's because we can't think our way through this process. It's all resolved. Anything from, you know, because I talk a lot about trauma, but this could also just be past stress. Because one of the things I think that people don't talk about enough, I kind of alluded to it earlier, is just managing stress, you know, as an entrepreneur or as a leader. And I think a lot of folks, you know, they start their businesses and they do have a high capacity to handle, you know, a lot on their plate. And in any given moment, because I mean, you and I both know, it's like you're going to run into some shit, you know, as an entrepreneur. Like you're going to have to put out some fires. There's going to be just stuff that happens that you don't expect. And yeah, you might be able to handle that in any given moment. But what people don't talk about is managing stress over time. And that's the real key. Because if enough of those, you know, kind of fires, you know, happen over time, well, that's going to take a toll. And, you know, it's going to take up a lot of energy. And if you don't know how to resolve the stress cycle, you're just going to keep looping because your body and your nervous system don't know that fire has been put out and that you're good and that you can move on. Like I kind of like I equate it to like having like 50 different browser tabs open in your mind.
Right.
Because if we don't know how to close those out, then all of a sudden, because we've all seen that person who like that's the way they operate. Like you open up their laptop or, you know, you see like 50 tabs and you're like, how, oh my gosh, like that's instantly overwhelming, right? Because you're like, what the heck? Are you, what camp do you fall in?
That is 100% me.
Okay. Yeah. So that, right. And it's not, and here's, but let me like backtrack just a little bit. It's not necessarily always, you know, a bad thing because, you know, we've all seen the memes of like, all right, you fall into either that category or it's like single browser tab or like inbox zero or you have like 36,000 emails, you know,
Yeah,
and clicks and
like 20, 30,000 unopened emails.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. and that's completely fine. But for certain people, because how many people have, you know, is either like looked at your phone or seen your desktop and be like, oh my gosh, dude, and they call you out on it.
Oh, for sure.
Because it's overwhelming for them.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And so like for certain people, like that just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right?
There's an anxiety in that.
100%. Yeah. It gives them so much anxiety. And
it's not even theirs and they're like freaking out. I'm like, why do you care about this more than I do?
Totally.
Was that a browse of me?
But that's their nervous system. No, it's not a problem. It says nothing about you and everything about them.
Yeah.
Like I have a good friend. It's a running joke between her and I because she's more like you and I'm like the inbox zero, like one tab at a time, etc. And we just give each other shit all the time about it. But it's quite literally, you know, it's kind of wiring and it's all about kind of capacity and what works for you, you know. And certain people, it might just be ADHD. And
like, are you one of those?
And that's fine too. But yeah, that's effectively. Did I answer the question well?
Yeah, so you've got my attention. I deal with a lot of stress all the time. How do I manage it?
There's no one answer.
Okay.
There's no one single answer. What the best thing I can tell you though is offering frameworks, because there's 4 steps to the stress cycle. And if you know these 4 steps, it can really help you manage manage it both kind of acutely, like in the moment, as well as over time. So the first step is just the trigger. I mean, that's, it's the stressor, like whatever it's the, the client emailing saying like they're canceling their, $500,000 contract or whatever. That flips the switch. Then step 2 is there's the response. And typically the response is you either want to move towards it, meaning like in this case, like, all right, we're going to fix this. I'm going to reach out, we're going to figure it out. People want to move away and just avoid it, which is also super common. Or
they freeze.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I'm tracking.
They freeze. And so freeze is actually a blended state. It's like an upward moving, like I can, like fight or flight energy, as well as a downward moving shut down energy. And it's actually the most active of our states, because if you try to navigate this with the microphone, if you take your hands and you push them together really hard, that's effectively mimicking a freeze state. It's a tremendous amount of energy, because your nervous system simultaneously wants to fight and flight and do. And I say fight or flight, but we have healthy amounts of this just to get out of bed. Like you need fight or flight energy just to get out of bed, just to kind of go through your day and do things. So that's that's a healthy amount of fight or flight energy. Healthy amount in an emergency could also just be like, holy shit, I got to run as fast as I can and get the fuck out of here. That's also a healthy amount of fight or flight energy given the situation. So anyway, but you can also have, like I said, that shutdown energy. So and I'm going on this tangent for a reason, because so many people I see are stuck in a freeze state, and it takes a tremendous amount of energy because it really is the most active of all of our states. So anyway, back to the stress cycle. Step 2 is the activation. It's the it's the doing. And usually it's either like fight, flight, freeze, toward, away, or freeze.
Yep.
Common wisdom, I put that in air quotes for a reason, says like, oh, just take a deep breath and calm down. Like people think that like that's usually the solution to kind of regulating your nervous system. In actuality, that can actually make us skip step 2 and try to go straight to step 4. And I will get to 3 and 4 in a second. So be wary of the whole just like take a deep breath, and calm down, because we need to actually complete step 2. This is where people get hung up, because that step 2 energy of whatever wants to happen, kind of like I was saying earlier, that thing that wants to happen, that thing that your body wants to do isn't allowed to happen. When that's not allowed to happen, the stress cycle gets interrupted, and that energy gets stuck in your body in some way, shape, or form. And it can present over time from in any way from, let's say, just sore muscles to like deep fatigue, all the way to like autoimmune disorders, cancers, things like that. There's a lot of research coming out around the links between stress, trauma, and like long-term disease. So step 3 is kind of the come down. And it's where your rational brain kind of comes back online, and you're like, okay, I can think a little bit straighter. I feel a little more grounded. And you can actually see like, oh, wow, like I was just really angry. I snapped at my coworker, and that snapping would be step 2. I snapped at my coworker because, like, oh, wow, like I got really scared and I was just really stressed, in the moment. And, maybe I can apologize, and then step 4, resolve. And that resolution, that's typically where like a deep breath or some sort of grounding exercise. And there's a lot of tools that people can use in any given stage in order to let that energy move. And it comes down to letting it move safely. It's like step 2, if you're really pissed off, if somebody has like broken a boundary and like, made you mad, or a client, is like, despite 17 calls and emails or whatever, like they're still not paying you. It makes sense that you might get really angry because you provided a service and they're not paying you for it. So, and this is going to sound a little hokey, but things like pushing against a wall, ripping up paper, that's where like those stress balls, kind of come in. Just letting that energy move, giving it a safe direction to move in, to where, and do it until your body says like, okay, hold on, like I need to rest.
And this is in step 2.
Yeah.
When you're having that response, you have to channel that energy into another place.
Exactly.
What's productive.
Yeah, exactly. And your body will tell you, like your body will tell you, when you're pushing against that wall, or you're ripped up enough paper, or, whatever, you can squeeze a pillow, your body, you'll just get tired. Like you'll get tired, or you'll feel kind of like a bit of like a break, and maybe like tears will come, or, or something like that. There's a bunch of different responses that come afterwards. And then, you're in step 3. But it's those 4 steps. That's the entire stress cycle. And it doesn't have to take a really long time to complete. Sometimes you can literally do this in the matter of like 30 seconds. For bigger stressors and bigger triggers, it might take a little bit longer. But when you're conscious of it, when you're conscious of moving through all of these steps, you free up that energy that otherwise could get stuck and loop. And, then like all that energy is good to go the next day or the next hour or whatever to go tackle the next thing.
So that's pretty cool. That's like a kind of like a reactive framework to like, respond to that step 2 response and get through it. Going back to the like trauma piece, which is like the driver of that response, how can you rewire that traumatic event or whatever to not have that response anymore? Is that a possibility, or is that something that you're focused on?
Yeah. So first of all, it's not just to be really clear, just because like I feel like an immense amount of integrity with this work. So it's not always going to be driven by trauma per se.
Okay.
Like people do shitty things, right? Like you're going to get triggered, and and so not everything is a trauma response, let's say. And I'm mostly saying this just because of like the TikTokification of mental health, where people get on like, oh, like that's a trauma response. Like, oh, like like you got super upset when your coffee was late. It's like, or your coffee was just late, and like that has nothing to do with past traumas, or the barista took a while or whatever. That's what I meant to say. But yeah. So yeah, getting back to your question, it's all about building capacity over time. And what I mean by that is like your nervous system is it's flexible. It's flexible. And what happens where there's like, let's say too much stress or too much trauma in a given moment, because trauma isn't necessarily the event, it's actually what happens inside of you as a result of the event. 2 people can go through the exact same experience. One comes out with, let's say, trauma or like long-term PTSD and whatnot, and the other person might come out completely okay. And it's about capacity within your nervous system. And what I mean by that, it's kind of like blowing up a balloon. If you blow up a balloon too fast, or if you blow it up too much, it's going to pop, right? Because it doesn't have enough time to stretch and adapt to kind of that new shape, that bigger shape. And our nervous system is the exact same way. And this is what somatic experiencing does, is it just stretches the person enough. And we're going to, it's kind of like eating a hamburger. Like if you eat the whole hamburger at once, like you're going to choke. Like that's not advisable, not a good idea. It's also not going to be very enjoyable, right? Or you could just take a bite of it. I'm like, okay, I'm going to chew this a little bit. Yep, this tastes good. I can handle this. I'm not having an allergic reaction. I mean, not that we like actively think that. And then I'm going to move forward with taking another bite. And that's what we do with somatic experiencing specifically, is we kind of recall sometimes, or we follow the signs and symptoms of your nervous system. And so, if I look at you and I see like, oh, wow, you're short of breath right now. And, you're kind of like this. And I know for, not everybody's watching on video, but I'm kind of contracting my body right now. I don't look like I'm very approachable. I don't look like I'm very sociable. I kind of look like pretty isolated right now, right? So if I see somebody in that state, it's like, okay.
You're literally trying to protect yourself. Like,
Exactly. It's your nervous system trying to
like covering your vitals when you cross your arms.
100%. 100%. Yeah. I mean, if I sit here like this, I'm just sitting here. I've got this like, fuck you, don't approach me energy, right?
Yeah.
I could exaggerate it more, but I don't want to hit the microphone.
No.
But you're trying to protect yourself. And so, in that case, what I might do is like, hey, can you like focus on those trees out there, or just find something pleasant or neutral? Because what's happening is that person's looping in that moment, and they don't know how to get out. And a lot of people, it's like the only thing they know, because it feels so bad or so intense or so stressful that's the only thing that they can focus on. So a lot of times, like, we actually move away from the thing. We've all kind of heard the conventional of like, no, you got to sit with it, you got to process it, et cetera. Well, this is part of sitting with it and processing it. Sometimes we go away from the thing because we have to find safety. And we do what's called pendulation, is we pendulate toward the safe thing, the neutral thing, to give your system a taste of safety. And then we can go back to the tough thing, the activation. And we're not necessarily going to go straight into the middle of it. We might, the analogy I use is, instead of jumping straight into the lake, we might actually just sit on the side of it and just observe the lake. And so much of this stuff, like, this is the stuff, our nervous systems are scanning 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for threats. It's always happening, and it's happening on a subconscious level. And, because in this room, those of us that are in this room right now, it's happening. Like, we kind of know where the exits are. Like, we, if something behind you, like, really like jumped, I'm looking like at the window behind you, and I did this, if I got startled, you would probably be pretty concerned of,
right,
like, what the hell's happening, right? And that is all happening on a subconscious level, because we're all designed to keep each other safe, because, like, think about like animals, like in Africa, one of them like pokes up because they heard a stick break, and then every other one freezes because they saw the first one freeze. And we're designed the exact same way. We just happen to be human, and we're capable of rational thinking, and we think we're smarter than it, and we're not.
So when you say that you pendulate and then you go back into that trauma response, but you're standing on the lake on the side, what is that like actual practice like? Is it like a visualization? Are you doing a visualization to get back into that event?
It could be a lot of different things. It depends on the person's strengths. Sometimes visualizations, or like if somebody's able to access that, then great. Sometimes the actual sensation of something. So like let's say,
that must be interesting to reproduce the actual event.
Well, it's not even. Well, we're generally never reproducing it per se.
Okay.
It's and this is a key thing, because people, let's say, who aren't trauma informed and aren't trauma trained, will sit there and be like, no, like, you have to bring it to mind and sit with it, et cetera. That's the last thing that we want to do, because that can actually re-traumatize people. And so, also, I realize, like, I keep going on like so many tangents. So like,
I talk like this too. I'm like,
yeah, okay, that's cool.
I just track it. It makes perfect sense.
All right, as long as you're tracking, because there's just so many like nuances to this.
It makes perfect sense.
And I'm kind of still getting the hang of like presenting it in a palatable way.
Articulating it really well. Yeah.
All right, cool. Yeah. So, we can use sensation, we can use image, we can use behavior, because sometimes people, again, like this is a behavior when I'm like really scrunched up and kind of in this, isolated protective posture. Behavior could also be like slumped down, right? So we look at behavior. So depending on how the person is presenting, so we don't have to go back. 99% of the time, I have no clue what happened to the person. They might also not have an idea. And the beauty of somatic experiencing is I don't need to know. I just need to know how it's presenting in the present, so that we can let your nervous system resolve itself. I'll give you a real life example. So I was working with this one person, unbelievably successful entrepreneur, started and exited from 3 businesses, and is more than financially secure. And he came to me and he was like, dude, like, I feel disconnected from everything. I just feel shut down. I don't even feel connected to my kids. And he's feeling a lot of shame around all of that because logically he knows. He's like, I have everything I've ever wanted. This is everything I've worked for. And I don't understand why I'm feeling this way. And in his case, it was stress cycle after stress cycle after stress cycle that wasn't able to be completed. So we're sitting there and we do what's called grounding and orienting at the beginning of every session. I was like, oh, just like, connect. And he's having a hard time connecting with anything. And I was like, all right, what are you noticing in your body? He's like, oh, I'm feeling a little tension in my neck. Okay, let's just stay with that. And then I'm sitting there watching him and just allowing, because a lot of times like there can be silence in a lot of the sessions that I do because we're waiting for the thing that wants to happen next. And then all of a sudden his shoulder kind of started to move a little bit. And I was like, oh, like we got a little movement there. Like, are you noticing that? And he's like, yeah, I'm not sure why. I was, all right, can we just be with that? Long story short.
And he's just keeping his consciousness on that. You're just driving him to like put his awareness on that event.
Yeah. Yeah. And to see if it's tolerable, because sometimes like some people they can be literally sitting there like wringing their hands and be like, yeah, I'm calm. I'm cool. I'm here. And I'm like, are you? And obviously I'm never saying that.
Right.
But again, all of this happened. It's
that must be really cool to see. Like,
it's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, long story short, like this guy eventually more movement, comes into his body. Then the freeze kind of came up. We let that resolve itself because freeze can very often resolve itself if you're in kind of the safe presence of another person and they actually kind of know like how to guide somebody through it. And
so you see the freeze. What do you say to him? Like,
is that okay to be with? Is that okay to be with? And here's the thing, just for anybody listening, like it's not always something you can do on your own. This is also not something you can just like guide your friend through. You need to work with a qualified practitioner, a trained practitioner, to do this stuff. But it is helpful for recognizing your own sort of freeze states. And so very often, because again, freeze is that upward moving sympathetic fight or flight energy. It's the I can energy. Getting squashed by the I can't, the shutdown energy. Shutdown, it's like depression, it's helplessness, that's, that type of energy. And then you're stuck because your body isn't sure whether it's safe to, like, whether the safest route would be to actually flee or to like shut down and effectively like play possum, right? Because again, these are survival mechanisms. With freeze, what needs to happen first is the collapse. We need to let that shutdown happen. And it's super common in entrepreneurs because logically, like we know that we are capable, that we can do these things, et cetera. And so we're just like, oh, and then, the one of the common phrases that kind of goes through people's minds, like, oh, why can't I just fill in the blank? And this goes to like, going back to like emails, just responding to emails, like little tasks end up feeling like monumental things when you're in a free state, like taking out the trash. And then we call it wired and tired. And so you're just like, oh my gosh, like I feel exhausted. Like, let me go rest. And then as soon as you lay down, your mind speeds up and, starts to think about like all the different things that you need to do and you have to get done. And so then you're like, wait, hold on. Like I was trying to take a nap here and the cycle just keeps going. That's a pretty classic example of a freeze state, of how somebody can identify a freeze state. Very often, a lot of scrolling on your phone, that happens, in these states while all of the tasks continue to kind of build up and, just pile on. And then, shame can be a part of that too. But I'm digressing a little bit here. So yeah, there's not necessarily one way to get through a freeze state. It can be a little nuanced, but that collapse needs to happen first. And it's like an ice cube melting. That process happens slowly. And what happens with entrepreneurs is they're just like, no, like, okay, like I know how to do this. Like I've got all the steps, that's why I'm a little cautious of like work with a qualified practitioner with this. Because we're used to being able to like, all right, just like tell me what I need to do, like put it on the to-do list and like I'll knock it out. And they want to rush the process of coming out of a free state. And, this could be a day-long process. It could also be a months-long process, depending on how long somebody has been in that state. So it's like an ice cube slowly melting. And then, going back to the example of this one person, we just saw that slow kind of thaw out. And then all of a sudden, like a little more movement, kind of came in, and I saw him start rocking back and forth a little bit. And I was like, oh, and he's like, yeah. And I was like, all right, tell me what's happening now. He's like, it feels like I'm waking up. And you could see it in his eyes, like there was this like glimmer in his eyes all of a sudden. And he was like, what the heck? He was like, I have not felt like this in months. And I was like, all right, let's slow this down.
Can't expand it too much.
Exactly. Yep. See, he's catching on. All right, I'm doing something right here. Because that's the thing. When somebody, like when, let's say, the positive things are happening, people want to just jump right into them. Well, that can result in another shutdown as well. So we have to just take that slowly. And we're like eating that burger, just bite by bite. And so very slowly, we invited more movement. And eventually he was standing up, he was stretching, et cetera. And then, he sits back down, we do a little grounding, and he's sitting there and he's like kind of like brushing back his hair and I don't even know how to describe what I'm trying to, it's hard with headphones on. But he's just like running his hands over his face.
Yep.
And his eyes are just like wide. And he's like, dude, this is the best feeling right now. He's like, and I was like, tell me more about it. He's like, I feel motivated. I was like, bingo. And that was just one freeze cycle that we were able to take him through. And we've done that over and over in more sessions. And slowly that has like woken up more and more energy within him. And, he's starting to get back to feeling kind of motivated and, grounded and in what we call a ventral vagal state. I alluded to earlier, like that rest and digest state. He's starting to feel like that more often than not.
What would have been if you weren't there with him, what would have been his natural response to that initial movement? And that would have kept that energy tied up in comparison to what you guys did that freed it. Like, what was the differentiation between those two responses?
I think a lot of people, because it's just like, oh, I've got a sore neck. First of all, he wasn't even really even able to get there on his own. Like he would have just dismissed the pain in his neck, because we talked about it afterwards. He was like, how does a little sensation in my neck end up resulting in this? And this is where it's the signs and symptoms in your nervous system, because the neck pain, that neck tightness was the sensation that he was able to feel. And everybody's, used to that in one way, shape, or form, because we sit there, we hunched it over at our desk. We carry a lot of stress in our shoulders and in our necks. It's really, really common.
We're like storing that energy there.
Yeah, effectively. Yeah. So, I mean, that goes back to, Besser Van der Kolk's, the body keeps the score. And all of that energy just gets stuck in our bodies unless we know how to release it and let it go. And so
it's really cool.
Yeah. So, I mean, he would have effectively just been like, oh, my neck's a little sore. And he probably would have like tried to stretch it, et cetera. But when we slow it down, and this is one of the best tools that we can use, that I use all the time in somatic experiencing, it's also wildly infuriating to like the go-getters and the type A's, including myself. I mean, I can't tell you how many times my somatic practitioner has like slowed me down. And, if somebody like just kind of spontaneously like makes a fist, I'm like, oh, hey, would it be okay to do that again, but really slowly? And then all of a sudden, like in that slowness, like maybe a memory will pop up of, a time when a past boss, really pissed them off and disrespected them and like talked down to them, or, a childhood memory, pops up of them being bullied, or something like that. And it doesn't always happen that way. It doesn't necessarily have to be tied back to a particular memory, but when we slow things down, as I did with that one particular entrepreneur, that's where the magic happened. Because what happened was he was able to just sit with it, and that's where the thaw started to happen. And then we see these micro movements. And again, it's the thaw rather than just like, him like grabbing his head and stretching his neck in one fell swoop, which would not have resolved, wouldn't have resolved the problem.
How'd you get into all this? I know you said like what triggered your interest in it, but what was the actual process of making this your business?
Yeah, so it's really, it came out of my own health and healing journey. I've got a background in advertising sales, so I worked for Pandora, the Wall Street Journal, and then a couple of other smaller firms. But then, simultaneously was doing my own health and healing work. And through my own trauma healing, I just got really passionate about bringing this work to other people. And like, I was the guy, whether it be in my friend group or at work, like I would talk very openly about therapy. And we're talking like, 10, 15 years ago, which is light years in terms of, kind of where we're at with kind of the mental health discussion on a macro level now. It's like 10, 15 years ago, like there weren't that many people, talking about this. So I would have like coworkers shuttle up like at the water cooler, and be like, hey, like I heard you saying you're going to therapy. Like I've been looking for a therapist. And I realized it's like, oh, like the process of finding a therapist is awful. Like even when it goes really well, it can still be incredibly stressful and disheartening and whatnot. And having lived in Atlanta, New York, and now Denver, I myself have had to go through that process multiple times and saw how much it sucked. So the wheels started turning back in like 2017, 2018 on like the idea for my startup. And, eventually left my job, left that career to launch my startup in January of 2020. And we can all think back to, what was about to happen then. And launched Inlet. And it was a platform, it was an app that was focused on digitizing the word of mouth ways in which we typically find the best clinicians and practitioners. And
oh, wow, interesting.
And it turned out it was like the best timing and the worst timing, because like best in terms of like, the pandemic was about to hit and, people really needed help at that time. It was also for me personally, it ended up being, this is a double-edged sword, because like during lockdown and whatnot, I had like something to focus on, but it was also the only thing that I had to focus on. So that led to burnout that was unrecognized. And mind you, I'm very mindful of mental health and whatnot. And I was not recognizing burnout in myself at the time. Because I didn't recognize it, that turned into full-blown depression. And that ended up being the downfall. I told you, when we first met, I was like, yeah, my mental health company took a toll on my mental health. And, just the ultimate irony, right? And
Hilarious.
And if I had been more aware or more mindful, of all of that, and I'm not sitting here beating myself up over it, I did the best I could at the time, then we would have been able to get the next round of funding and, and keep going. But because I had, entered that really just shut down, like depressed state, it was just one of those where I would sit there and I talked to, a fair amount of entrepreneurs that this happens to, where they're just like, oh man, I'm just staring at my computer for 45 minutes because they haven't managed that stress over time, or past trauma is catching up with them. And that's exactly what was happening to me, because I wasn't managing the stress well, because I was solely focused, because I was like, well, like I got nothing else to do during lockdown. Like, let's, continue to just crush it with Inlet. And so once I ended up shutting it down, I had already started doing some coaching on the side with some people. And I just kind of had this gut feeling. I was like, oh, this is what I really want to do. Like, this is what I'm meant to do. And I'm not ruling out like founding another startup in the future.
But it's all part of the journey.
Yeah, it's all part of the journey for sure. I've got a couple ideas actually brewing right now. They combine like my current experience with, some technology and whatnot. But and so eventually kind of started coaching me. And what I realized is I was like, oh, this is, so much of where they're stuck really traces directly back to past trauma. And the people that they've been working with, including myself, weren't qualified and weren't trained to actually be able to, we're talking, some of these folks are brilliant business coaches and whatnot that these people and therapists that they were working with, but they just didn't have the skill set, the training to actually address the past trauma. And so that's where I got my first. That's when I got my first 2 somatic certifications, and then now I'm in year 2 of the 3-year somatic experiencing training.
It's fantastic. If you could say one, like in 2 sentences, one thing that you know now that you wish you knew when you started your entrepreneurial journey, or some sort of advice to entrepreneurs that you think people should know, what would it be?
Oh, let's see. I have to just decide on one thing.
I mean, go.
No, I know that was a question. Well, let me pause for a second.
You don't have to decide on one thing. There's no actual framework.
Well, no,
guide.
No. I honestly, I think I actually just answered it. It's pause. It's pause, because I think it's so easy to get wrapped up in just the day to day. Because I always say, like, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're looking for either a spiritual experience or a personal growth experience, start a business, because you'll get one or the other, or largely both, depending on your worldview.
That's such good advice.
Yeah. And don't ignore the personal aspect of it. Like, you've got to pause sometimes, because I think that one, from just, let's say, like a mental and a personal health perspective, like those pauses are just going to, help you create just a little space to stay connected with not just yourself, but stay connected with your business. Because so many people, like, they get 5 and 10 years down the road and they're like, my business is not the thing that I originally, like, I don't feel tied to it anymore, because they were just kind of following the market, following the data, like a good entrepreneur does. But the spirit of why they initially started it, they're very disconnected, from that. And so I think just these little pauses here and there, and we're talking, like, just set an alarm for like 3 or 4 times a day to just, okay, like, I'm just going to take a 5-minute little pause and just get a little space and get a little perspective, both from a business side and a personal side. I think the power of the pause is one of the most underrated tools, one of the most underrated things that people can actually utilize.
Yeah, it's some really good advice, and it's super insightful work. It's inspiring. There's definitely a lot of things that I have to digest that you talked about that I think are relevant to my life as well. So I commend you for what you're doing. If people want to find your services, or interested in what you're doing, or want to talk to you more, have questions for you, like, where are the best places to find you?
Yeah, connect with me on Instagram. It's just @murph.live, MURPH.live. That's also my website URL. So either one of those places is a really great place to connect.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming out. It was super awesome talking to you.
Yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Yes, yeah. Cool.